We are here at Funding the Commons and Earth Commons with Gregory Landua. He is the founder of Regen Network, and Atossa Saltani, Global Coordinator of Sacred Headwaters Initiative. Gregory and Atossa both spoke today, and very excited to sit down. Thanks for doing this.
Honored to be here.
Great to be here.
So Atossa, I want to start, maybe just share at a high level some of the key messages that you shared today at Earth Commons, and maybe a bit of a summation around Sacred Headwaters.
Sure. I spoke about the Amazon system and its role in the biosphere. I think it's really important when we're designing solutions to have as much context as possible. And the Earth systems, looking at the Amazon as literally the heart of the hydroclimatic system of the biosphere, the way the Amazon pulls in moisture from the atmosphere. The trees basically create a low pressure zone that draws in the moisture. When it rains, the trees recycle that rain back into the sky. We're talking about 1,000 liters of water vapor per day. Those, basically the trees in the Amazon generate an atmospheric river that's 20% larger than the Amazon River, and into the sky. It hits the Andes, comes north and south. Our hydrological system in California depends on Amazon rain, as does 95% of the rain that falls on the continent of South America. About half the rain in the Amazon stays in the Amazon and basically cycles through the Amazon. The other half goes around the world. It's literally the planet's rain machine. But this year, the drought in the Amazon was the worst in 120 years of recorded history, partly because of global warming, but also because of deforestation has destabilized that system. And we're seeing a collapse of the hydrological system. We're seeing an unraveling of the forest, which really spells, disaster for the climate. It's a tipping point that could tip all the other planetary tipping points. And scientists are ringing the alarm bells saying, the Amazon's tipping, and we've got to act now to protect 80% of the forest and to restore 6% of the lost forest cover. And this year, the drought was so bad that deforestation in the Amazon has literally killed off millions of fish. Has been one of those mass extermination events for fish populations in the Amazon, for the pink dolphin. So it's critical we take action, and soon. So I gave that context, and then really the work was about how do you center solutions on indigenous wisdom, on marginalized communities, in getting the money to the front lines. Literally less than 1% of all commitments to climate and biodiversity programs ends up reaching the communities on the ground, in the territories. So Sacred Headwaters is creating this, alliance that indigenous peoples get to basically lead and govern, and creating mechanisms to get the funding to the front line. So that was really my message today, is, reflections on how you incorporate indigenous wisdom and also indigenous peoples and the front lines into the solutions that we're folks in the tech world are engineering.
Well, it's a perfect segue to the work, Gregory, and why the two of you are together now, that you've been doing with Regen Network, which needs no introduction to most, but if you can please share at a high level a bit about Regen Network and then how it fits in with this work.
Yeah, so the intention for Regen Network has been to create a land steward owned and operated system for ecological accounting, remittances, and so, if we're going to be bringing financial tools to bear to protect and regenerate living systems, and if we're going to be, interfacing between indigenous communities and the global monetary economy, I think Regen Network has the thesis that the agency and power and tools really need to be held and governed by the communities themselves. And so we've been building an open infrastructure, a community-governed system using blockchain technology and other adjacent technologies to sort of create what you could think of as a platform cooperative, right? Where the different communities who are stewarding these landscapes can engage in defining the terms of a credit relationship or other financial remittance in exchange for their conservation, but also get to be owner operators of the marketplace and the platform itself. So that as we succeed in flowing all of these resources to protect and regenerate the Amazon and other vital ecosystems, the people who are doing the hard work end up being the ones who also have the financial upside for the success of the system.
And you said something, in your talk here at Earth Commons, which just ended a few moments ago. But you said moving the registry from a noun to a verb. Can you share more on that?
Yeah, I mean, a key part of this is, up until now, especially, most people will be somewhat familiar with voluntary carbon markets and emerging voluntary biodiversity markets. And for those who aren't familiar, there's some amazing interviews on Ma Earth about this in more detail. But, when people use the word registry, they're oftentimes referring to a bureaucratic institution or standards body that defines a set of rules that different actors in the marketplace use to determine what is valuable and how that value is created and verified. We think that needs to be a much more dynamic and open process in order to center on indigenous peoples. If we're going to have ancestral wisdom, if we're going to have deep and grounded conversations about what real value truly is, that can't be imposed by sort of a technocratic elite from New York City or Geneva or wherever on top of a community that has actually been succeeding in stewarding their ancestral landscape for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. So instead, flipping the script and saying, hey, we are trying to be a service for translation for a deeper wisdom of what is valuable so that wisdom can be translated and can have a symbolic representation that is legible and understandable to the modern world, but maintains its essence and its integrity. And we don't think that can happen if you're sort of landing this institutional and bureaucratic process on top of an indigenous community. Instead, we feel like there needs to be a deep listening process, a partnership, and as a platform, as Regen Network, we feel like our role is more to facilitate the community's expression of value than it is to tell the community what is valuable in their context.
So let's center those indigenous communities that you're working with in the Amazon. Like, what should we know about their aspirations, their struggles, the lands that they're stewarding, what they're trying to achieve? Here we are in 2024. The crisis is upon us, as you outlined. But yeah, can you share more about what they're going through?
Sure. So, just globally speaking, first is that indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the world's population. Their territories, which are mostly in the tropics, account for 80% of the world's biodiversity and almost half of the world's intact forests. So they have an outsized role to play in all the conversations about biodiversity, mass extinction, climate crisis. And they're actually doing a really good job of stewarding the commons and working collectively. The land is held collectively. It's intergenerational visions and life plans where they talk about the seventh generation. They have a living earth worldview. Like, basically everything's alive. The forest is alive. The spirits are there. There's spiritual and material dimensions to the forest, not just the material dimensions. So more than human life is valued. There is intrinsic value, identity of indigenous peoples as forest guardians, which doesn't necessarily translate to market value. Also wealth, they are helping us rethink wealth. They might have zero in their bank account, but they're rich in clean water, clean air, medicinal plants, ancestral knowledge systems, and very much based on reciprocity and respect and reverence for life. So, they have so much to teach the modern world. And yet, because they're outside of the most of the in remote regions, in the Amazon, for example, in the headwaters, you have 30 indigenous nations that were working together now. And these are nations who were maybe at one point at odds with one another, have now united and said, we need to actually think bigger. We can't just think about one battle here, one battle here. We have to look at the whole of the river basin. So they're modeling bioregionalism. They didn't call it that, but it's now, it's being called that now. But the idea is that we look at the integrity and the well-being of current human populations on all kin, all the other species, and the spiritual realm for here through the next 7 generations. So that framework of looking at the entire river basin lend itself well to this idea of a bioregional plan, a bioregional life plan that protects the future generations of all life and the spiritual dimensions of the non-material world. And so that's the context around which the Sacred Headwaters was, born and is now moving forward to really put forth permanent protection, basically leaving the extractive economy behind, bringing land rights, clarifying and shoring up land rights and the rights of nature, and really pushing for a transition that basically takes us from this kind of life-blind, extractive economy to a well-being economy centered on indigenous principles of buen vivir, this idea that life happens in harmony with itself and with all, basically in fractal states of harmony. And it's a very deep spiritual and philosophical tenet that we're attempting to now execute and to make happen in this part of the Amazon. But a lot of it has to do with stop the harm, give space, and work on restoration. The droughts and the problems in the Amazon with extractive industries have done 2 things. One is that they have really diminished the fish population. And then the other thing is that the contamination from oil and mining has created persistence into the ecosystems to where, yes, there might be fish, but in many places it's not fit for human consumption because of mining waste or oil waste. And so we need to address basically regeneration, restoration, and harm prevention as part of what we, bring about in the next decade. And we don't have a lot of time. And so basically, there's an invitation by indigenous peoples to joining them to build true allyship and engineer new. And I wouldn't say engineering is the wrong word, but maybe to redesign our concepts of our human aspirations, our economy, our governance systems.
Yeah, and we'll put a link in the show notes to that bioregional life plan. It's a beautiful plan and document and, output of many years of work and generations of dreams. And I had the privilege to join you both down in the jungle, down in Ecuador. And what really struck me in part with the community of Shara Mensa, for example, was just how simple a few key frameworks were around, okay, we need to stop the logging of primary forests. We need to make sure that there are no new roads that are being built in deep Amazonian, rainforest territories where essentially once that road goes in, it opens up all of these additional downstream effects of extractive enterprises and industrial mining and everything else. And yeah, such an interesting relationship with money. And I want to ask you about that since it's also a segue into the eco credits pilot that you've been conducting. So yeah, help us understand the people who have been deep in these forests outside of the modern world. Like, how do they relate to the current financial economy? And practically, like, how do we support them in ensuring that the stewardship of this biodiversity and the Amazon and all of the life persists?
The conversation about money is a very important conversation that we've been having with elders and with community leaders for the last 5 years. And what I understand is that most of their indigenous peoples who live in these remote regions have a reality where there's no need for money. They don't have rent, they don't have utility bills, except for now they do have satellite internet bills. But most of their basic needs are met by the forest, their food, their medicinal plants. A lot of it is right there. But there are basic things that drive the need to get money. What is that? One of them is healthcare. When you are bitten by a snake, or if you're having trouble with childbirth and you need emergency evacuation, that is thousands of dollars. And then the hospital bills and all of those things. There's no insurance. There's no guarantee for emergency evacuation. There's no ambulance service. So those kinds of things can drive, and families suffer from, accidents, or, we had someone fall off, building a house, fell off and became paralyzed. So there are basic needs around healthcare. The other driver of deforestation, destruction, and cultural erosion is the education system.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that most of these villages only have until 6th grade in their village, and usually there's one teacher for K through 6, and then they want to go to high school, which is required by law. The systemic change that it's required by law that you have to have a K through 12 education, but then you have to send your kid off to the city to get an education. They have to live in a dorm. They have to purchase their food. They have to have money to pay for medical bills if something happens, and they're also separated from their cultural context, and often may never come back, or maybe completely fall victim to what young people sometimes fallen victim to: alcoholism, abuse, exploitation, menial labor. And what they learn in school isn't even that relevant for the reality of being governors of their territories. So the education system takes away their identity, disconnects them from their true knowledge systems, and alienates them. And even then they feel inadequate. Like, this education to be an engineer or a doctor or something isn't relevant necessarily for their reality. And so of course they want higher education too, university education, and that's almost, impossible with the cost that it exists. So parents in the forest have to figure out how to pay for school supplies, how to send their kids to the city, how to take care of their kids, and ultimately what they get back is adults who have lost their identity and who may be a brain drain, maybe leaving the territory looking for jobs in the cities. So that system really, so education, healthcare, basic needs are what drives the money economy in these areas. And so one of the theories around solutions is that, if we had universal basic income and also universal basic services, the right to free medical evacuation, free health care, the right to a culturally appropriate education, investment in education in situ in these communities. In Shara, for example, wants to build a high school where their kids could stay and don't have to go to the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are some of the things that I think would shift the dynamic of destruction and cultural deterioration.
Mm. And is it fair to say that there's kind of a persistent also temptation of financial resources being offered that usually is associated with ecological destruction?
Absolutely. I mean, if during the pandemic, there were illegal logging companies and mining companies coming to these territories and say, "We'll give you $100,000 tomorrow if you let us log that island across the way." And those temptations, and for the most part, indigenous peoples have said no. It's amazing. They are not driven by the money value. Some are, maybe a few percent. In every community, you have a few people who become ambitious in that way. But for the most part, collectively, they are holding strong. But they're saying we need support for our basic needs. And so I think that's a great framework for us. But, Domingo Uyuncar, the president of the Sacred Headwaters Alliance, talks a lot about that, part of it is reinforcing indigenous cultural values, giving them tools to live a happy, they realize they live a happy life. And they see the suffering of the people who went to the cities and what have befallen to them. So I think, it's a process. It's a process. Of course, they have variations. There are realities that are, I would say, the communities that live along the roads, that live close to cities, they have a different reality. They are much closer to that money economy and want different things. But I think if we're talking about intact forest communities, there's a sense of that, life is more valuable than money. And the only time we're falling into the money needs for money is basic things like education and healthcare.
Gotcha. So I want to transition to the Jaguar Eco Credits pilot. And yeah, I have so many questions, but maybe if we can get a bit of a summation and description of how this program came about and what it is.
Yeah, I mean, the story can be told many different ways, but I think linking to what Atossa was just speaking about, so in the specific community of Xara and their neighboring communities, there are economic pressures and needs. As Atossa was mentioning, during COVID, there was a strong push around illegal logging of balsa specifically, which is a super fast growing, very light Amazonian wood. And there was that created conflict between different communities, some and individuals as well. Some people saying, hey, I need to, and different individuals have different pressures. Maybe someone has a sick family member and is thinking about that. Maybe someone has an ambition and is thinking about that. So, I mean, my experience is, yes, that there's very much, the entry of the monetary economy and the extractive economy is very real, it's visceral, and it's very present. And to use sort of economic terms here for a moment, there's kind of a cost-benefit analysis that each community and each individual is forced to go through, which is to say, are we going to sort of embrace and accept something like a road coming through our territory because that could generate these immediate economic opportunities? Am I going to accept this, offer from this illegal mining group or these loggers right now because I get money in my hands at this moment for whatever the reasons are? And there's good reasons and there's maybe reasons we would judge, but there's a million reasons why people might trade, the inheritance of thousands of years for something now. That's a present moment challenge that probably many people in the audience could resonate with having faced in some way in our own lives. And at the same time, these communities are, as Atossa mentioned, stewarding these landscapes that have enormous value in their intactness. And they're living lineages of cultures that have enormous value in their living intactness. And so I think the idea follows, what if we can honor the value that's being stewarded, the biocultural value that's being lived because of how much it gifts to the world, and resolve some of the tension? Because as Atossa mentioned, there is a need for some interface with the monetary economy, maternal health, education, emergency health. If nothing else, those three things are incredibly important. And if people are in a situation in which the only way they can access those basic services is to log the primary forest or embrace a road coming in or invite mining on their territory, maybe there's an opportunity to do better. And I think that's the intention of the Jaguar Eco Credit pilot, is to shift that. And I think I want to just take a pause and mention Per Espen Stoknes, who's a really important sort of leader in this whole story. He was traveling through Achuar territory when the illegal logging was happening and witnessed the tension and had a dream about what might become possible if he as an ally took steps to try to problem solve around that economic tension that's being faced. Like, what if there's the way that allies can gather together resources and make an offer to a community in which that community pledges to continue their ancestral stewardship and to take off the table logging and roads and mining, and to reinforce existing cultural patterns to manage according to their own life plans into the future? What if there can be a almost sacred contract between people who benefit from the intactness of the forest and the communities stewarding it with some basic agreements, right? And I think that what if emerged over the course of years of experimentation with Fundación Pachamama and Pachamama Alliance and the Amazon Sacred Headwaters, really led by the community of Xaramensa, expressing their dreams and desires and intentions around their life plan and making an invitation to explore this. And eventually this blossomed into this sort of, I would say, making those agreements more visible and tangible and replicable, making that process more replicable and turning it into this symbol of this Jaguar credit, right? Which the way that these Jaguar credits are emitted are through proof of existence of the jaguar in the forest, proof of the habitat integrity via satellite images and drone images, and reporting on the successful year-over-year administration of the Plan de Vida, of the commons management system of the community itself. So if they're making goals about education, about maternal health, about child health, about how they're managing agroforestry, that reporting system that they use as their internal norm system also forms a part of the sort of crediting framework, right? To sort of fuse that biodiversity and cultural integrity into this idea of a biocultural credit. This crediting pilot, again, I use the word credit because I believe, in the English language, it should remind us of trust. Like, I have confidence. My credit score is, in a financial system, it's the confidence a bank has that I'm going to pay back. But in this context, it's the confidence we as counterparties have that we're going to maintain right relationship with one another. So we may explore other words, and there's a very active and fun conversation around this. No attachment to it, really.
You had a great blog post on this. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah. And I think eventually we'll actually, in this context, likely there will be a word that emerges from the Achuar language to represent precisely what's happening, would be my guess. And there's a conversation. Uyuncar Domingo and I have been having this conversation a little bit. And anyway, so that'll be fun. Stay tuned. But for now, this concept of a biocultural credit that isn't tradable, right? That is it's sort of a symbolic representation of the contribution that the community is making to the global commons and the reciprocity of a donor, essentially, to the community for stewarding that landscape and helping resolve the deep economic tension by offering, essentially it comes down to sort of a community level basic income in a way. So how it's been calculated is that the community has specific needs, like health and education, nutrition, cultural preservation, minimal basic needs, that this program helps fund the community administration of that, right? And that's it. It's actually quite simple. But many of the most revolutionary ideas seem obvious and simple later, but really just that symbolic reciprocity and that exchange, we've been finding that people are really moved by it and really excited by it. You know, we started out with 75,000 credits, you know, and it's funny because I got emails from different people in the conservation industry saying, like, those credits are far too cheap. You're undercutting all of these things. And I'm sort of like, well, we're just, you know, we went through this process with the community, and this is what the community needs to meet their basic, to make an agreement and steward their own forest, right? It's this incredible, you know, it's $6 per hectare.
Over what period of time?
For a year, right? And I actually think it's even less, because oftentimes the community doesn't end up spending the whole annual budget, right? It's
so $6 per hectare per year is kind of the exchange in this current moment in time of how this is being priced for protection of that
ancestral stewardship services is you know, how I would describe the exchange. And you know, if you zoom out from Sharaminsa and you think about the 30 million plus hectares of land that's stewarded by the indigenous communities that make up the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance, and you calculate that out, it comes out to around $210 million a year to protect this you know, landscape that is essential for the functioning of the biosphere. It's incredibly inexpensive. And what's amazing is, so currently the way this is all running is about 60% of the money goes directly to fund that community process, right? 20% is maintaining the technical reporting apparatus and sort of the platform, which again, they're invited to co-own. So that actually can sort of there's another level of reciprocity that's possible. And 20% is used by Fundación Pachamama for all of the amazing work that they do to build capacity to help with reporting and all of these things. And I think there's a deep commitment, even though like in the standard conservation finance world, it's usual that only $1 out of 100 is making it to the community. And we have this pilot that's showing $60 out of 100 going to the community. There's also a deep commitment from Regen Network Development and Fundación Pachamama to say, actually, that's not good enough. We want as much of this money flowing directly. We want to disintermediate this as much as possible. And at the moment, I think it's safe to say that the community and anyone who's watching, if we lay this all on the table, can see that there's just a huge amount of effort and energy going in from Fundación Pachamama, from Regen Network. There's just a lot of work to get it stood up, but you can also see the future in which that work diminishes, and more of that is being held by, you know, little micro enterprises within communities themselves, and, you know, young people within this confederation of indigenous nations can start to pick up the pieces and become, you know, monitors, and can start to engage with marketing things, and can take that currently that 40%, which is sort of, you know, technical services and monitoring services and marketing services and all of these other things, and, you know, say, hey, I want to provide the marketing services, you know, and fantastic. There's 5% there. It's a whole nother micro enterprise that is aligned with the bioeconomy, that's aligned with the regenerative economy. So that's just to say, you know, I think we shouldn't, you know, pat ourselves on the back too much for beating the existing conservation finance by, you know, 60x in effectiveness. Instead, we should demand more, and we should continue to iterate on what this pilot is capable of in order to make it really efficient and effective at scaling to what's needed. Because if we, you know, if we go back to what Atossa was inviting us to consider, which is that the Amazon as an ecoregion, as a bioregion, is at a tipping point, right? The level of deforestation has reached this critical moment where we need to stop deforestation immediately, and we need to reverse deforestation and be actively regenerating and restoring ecosystems. So in order for that to happen, we need something that can scale rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is that if the most ways that we think about scaling just tromp all over context, and it tromps all over community, and it tromps all over ancestral wisdom. And I think what we're hopeful for is that this serves the right model for communities to have agency and tools, again, to express their plan de vida, express their commons management system, make a very simple deal, essentially, to cover their basic needs, whatever they define those to be, right? And in exchange for providing the public service of their continued stewardship of intact forest and potentially regeneration of forest that's already been cut down, which we haven't talked a lot about, but I think is just as important and possible.
Mm. Exciting. So, Atossa, I know that there's been so much made of the carbon cowboys coming to the Amazon, and there's been a lot of resistance from many indigenous communities, is my understanding, to carbon credits. And I know you also have had skepticism and critique of the carbon credits model, and yet here you are helping shepherd this new credits pilot. So help me understand, like, how did you get comfortable with this? And, maybe also, are there still existing concerns, or how is this different to you than kind of the traditional carbon credits that we always hear about?
Good question. Well, I want to say that in terms of the this is an experiment. It's a pilot, and the Sacred Headwaters Alliance is accompanying the Shara-Mensa Pachamama Regen Network initiative. We're monitoring it. We're helping understand it. We're looking at the lessons, or we're looking at how it might be replicated or revised or modified for the whole of the Sacred Headwaters. So it's a great experiment to start with. In the bioregional plan for the Sacred Headwaters, we always said that universal basic income and services were one of the key solutions.
Yep.
But we didn't define it as individual universal basic income. We always defined it as communal, which would fit well with community governance structures, the whole life plan, which is this idea of a collective vision that the community creates for their own, for the future of their own people and their territory. And so it aligns nicely. And I think the word credit, I'm also like, Gregory, can we not call it credit? Because that gets back to carbon credits and the cowboys and all of the things we don't like. Because it is really a stewardship contribution. Yeah. That's what it is. The world's crowdsourced stewardship contribution to fund a collectively held universal basic income fund for the community that they decide how to spend. So that part we really like. I think we have to work on the framework of credit. I think that the ideas that what we learn along the way, what I always talk about is that, we want to be mindful that we're also reinforcing the cultural identity that indigenous peoples espouse, which are, we are guardians of the forest. The forest is sacred. We will, defend the forest until the ultimate consequence. That is a deeply held spiritual and identity framework that they hold, and the worry is paying for conservation, paying for a result. You now have to act because you're being given money to act. Does that erode the intrinsic value to love and protect your forest? I think that's the big question. But at the same time, these communities have basic needs that warrant. The fact is, it is the state's responsibility, and this is kind of where it gets into markets versus government and governance.
Right.
It should be the state's responsibility to ensure a healthy and dignified and just life for all of its people.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of indigenous peoples in the Amazon, they've been ignored, they've been neglected, they've been abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
There is no state presence. So whereas here in the United States, we might have, safety net for people, have food stamps or welfare if they need it, government assistance, or they might have student loans if they have financial hardship, or they have emergency, assistance for medical care if they can't afford it. We're still not good. I mean, we have a long way to go in this country and in European countries. But what we're saying is that there is no safety net, and the state should still be held accountable and responsible for basically taking care of the basic needs of its people. And it's not. It's just looking at the Amazon as an empty place where they extract resources. So much of the wealth these countries have come from the extraction of resources in the Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the people who live there and protect this forest get nothing back. So I think that, that's the conversation is, do we want to just create financial instruments that move the responsibility and the responsibility and the funding to the private sector? And I think the answer isn't black and white. It's not like no or yes. I think the answer is we need to demand accountability from the government and responsibility for the government. But those governments are captured by corporate interests. They're not behaving in a way that's accountable to their people. So we do need solidarity economy, the caring economy, and really to think about these, philanthropy and the work that we're doing to, provide an opportunity for people to contribute as a way to give back, a way to redistribute wealth. We have to figure out how to redistribute wealth. We are excessively consuming and concentrating wealth by the 1%, and billions of people on the planet are starving and are being held neglected. So I think it comes up to the philosophical question, like how do we prevent the erosion of intrinsic value of a forest guardian and not totally couple it with payment for an action, and how do we reinforce those cultural values of stewardship, which are ancestral concepts? How do we keep them alive? Because, we can have intergenerational amnesia. In one generation, we can forget our ancestral values. And that's what we don't want to happen. But also, how do we perform emergency interventions for maintaining planetary, functioning, the biosphere? And the other question is, how do we not let the governments off the hook for their accountability and responsibility to its population? So we got to do both. And I think this is a good model because I haven't really I've looked at a lot of what is happening with the carbon markets and with biodiversity credits. And ultimately, I was saying to Gregory, you think I should say this in this room because there's so many people at this conference looking at carbon credits. I was like, what I've come to the conclusion of is that the voluntary carbon markets can create an injustice because it's allowing future contamination and future pollution, right? If you can afford it, if you can buy it somewhere else. And I think the framework that I would like to see is, yes, if you want to offset your future emissions, you first have to take responsibility for your historic emissions. Get down to paying back for your ecological debt and reduce as much as you can your future emissions. And then if there's still a little bit left, then maybe you're eligible to get some carbon credits. Otherwise, I think we're creating kind of more problems than we're solving. We're deferring the problems. We're creating injustices. We're allowing, for example, a company to expand its oil production by making it okay to continue to pollute. And so I would say I have philosophical concerns, but I'm really excited about this idea of framing the work we're doing as collective universal basic income, crowdsourced by the people who need to basically return financial wealth to the communities that are holding up the biosphere, who are managing the life support systems of our planet.
There's a lot there. It's so well spoken, and I think this point about maybe what we all start to say more and more is like, okay, if we're going to go into this world of credits, let's start with the debt that needs to be paid of the past, the ecological debt, before permission is granted to offset future contamination or destruction.
And also, one other thought that I really like, that we're at the Earth Commons, and that the idea of commons and seeing Indigenous people's way of collectively managing their territories as the commons. And so what is capitalism doing? It's constantly looking to put what is the commons into someone's private balance sheet.
Right.
There is this way that capitalism is flowing.
Totally.
Financialization is literally like the logic of cancer. It's flowing into places that it can capture and make into markets. And so I think partly we need that framework of commons, because what we want is, we don't want to erode the commons and allow financial flows to transfer ownership of the commons to the private sector. That's what carbon credits do often. That's what some of what the worst cases of the carbon cowboys, that's what's happening.
Right.
And so what I like about where we are and what the conversations we're having is, we're talking about how do we expand and maintain and support and finance the commons.
Right. Because these biocultural credits, these Jaguar credits, are not tradable. They're not accruing financial interest that can be speculated upon by the buyers.
Yep.
It's a direct transfer of funds into the community. Gregory, how are you thinking about the precautions or the positive interventions to address this idea that, even by just this simple act of putting a financial agreement in place, we could be interfering with the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivational, cultural system at play? And even though, here you have a community that wants to protect its forests, that's saying, yeah, we need some basic, collective income for these particular needs, does feel like it's a big threshold to cross. So curious how you're thinking about it.
Well, there's a lot there. There's a lot in what Atossa said as well. And I think the first thing I'll say is, what I think is most important is that we actually build a container of care and relationship that makes this depth of conversation possible. That's what's most important. And that's going to take a little time.
Long-form interviews, learning out loud. Let's do it.
It could take years to actually unfold that conversation in the right context in order to find a reconciliation that has the truth of that makes a practical embodiment and ensures that everybody is really clear about what's happening and has the right language and coherence.
Right. Which, just sorry to interrupt you, but runs so counter to all
scale
of the
it and do
scale,
the thing.
hyper. What is the blitz scaling?
And this is the challenge because as I was mentioning myself, there is an urgency. There is an urgency to protect and stop harm. There's an urgency to regenerate on one side, but then there's also a deep understanding that what is most important here is actually an accurate expression of relational value, and that relational value can be eroded when it's instrumentalized. Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about the specific, if I instrumentalize my labor into a vocation, what is the risk to my intrinsic soul expression? What is the risk to the intrinsic collective soul expression of a people? I would just say, is there risk? sure there's risk, but at the same time, if I'm thinking about my children and advising them on their future vocations, do I want to advise them to do something that they have no heart for in order to make the money that they need to keep the lights on, because I want to preserve, like, keep them away from the risk, keep them away from the risk that they destroy, by doing what they love, they somehow change what they love and it changes their motivation? I don't think so. I do think we all have to face this question, right? And it's almost a spiritual one, which is, why are we doing this? And my belief is that the deeper why needs to be centered on, we have a sacred duty and a sacred joy to be agents of regeneration and stewardship. And that feels deeply aligned and it feels deeply resonant. And if we can find ways to have that be our vocation at a communal level even more, to me, that's something to celebrate.
Right.
Wow, we are stewards of the forest and we're able to be compensated and have agency in a world in which that is hard to accomplish. We're able to take care of our basic needs and build the schools that we need. And, is there a hazard in there? Is there a hazard, sort of a moral hazard or spiritual hazard, that it instrumentalizes something that's sacred? Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I don't know that the existence of that moral hazard for me changes the sort of, like, to me, you have to build a set of the foundation of right relationship needs to exist. And that creates the container for people as a community and as individuals to confront that moral hazard and to maintain their rootedness and the right relationship. But I don't want to me, it would be sort of the epitome of paternalism,
right,
to say, because I'm worried that you're going to become impure, I want to take away the possibility that you even interact with this world. So we're going to do everything to, keep that hazard away from you. And again, I'm coming at that as like a father, where it's like I have to check myself with kids, where it's like I have to, these are other people's decisions to make, not my own, right? So
you wanted to jump in?
I would just say, it's not to say that we are that community of Shara Mensa, for example, doesn't have the right to have a collective fund to address their emergencies, and that collective fund is under their determination of how they want to do, and their goals are, obviously their goals are very much based on their intrinsic value of loving the forest and being forest guardians, and they're a model community. They're proud of being a model community. I'm just saying that, that we also have to look at the systemic change that we're seeking. For example, we have a governance system that is flawed. So we have places like, indigenous territories are a third of the Amazon. On the whole, indigenous peoples are nations. They school us, and they're not just communities. They're collection of communities that are in vast areas of the Amazon that they've guarded for thousands of years, and that they are nations, they're cultures that live in a landscape. They're biocultural, and they, we have governance system where a national park is created, sometimes even, displacing indigenous people. The national park has a budget. It's in the national parks. There's a line item for protecting and preserving the national park. Indigenous territories have no current access to government. They're right. So it's really also about the rights framework. Indigenous peoples, all peoples should have rights to healthy environment, to clean water, to healthcare, to education, economic, cultural, and social rights, human rights, collective rights. Those are, so it's not necessarily to say, it's not about so much, whether or not community of Share Mensa should have programs along their aspirations, is to say, what is the, responsibility of governance and governments to provide funding to Indigenous peoples for their governance, funding for schools and education and healthcare. Those are rights. Those are basic rights. And Indigenous peoples, because they're discriminated, because they're marginalized, because they're seen as far away and remote and invisible and not have economic power, have been left out, have been literally left out of the political process and the public policy process. And so it's also about saying we need to assert the rights of Indigenous and local communities, the rights of marginalized communities, to justice, to reparation, to if their land is polluted and now they have no fish to eat, there should be reparations. If they have 1 million hectares and no budget to monitor, protect it, are we we're waiting for philanthropy to come in and support Indigenous peoples to protect and govern their territories?
Mm-hmm.
And they're saying we're nations, we need some resources to govern our people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's a combination. It's not either or. Is saying are we moving too much into looking at how problems, societal ills need to be fixed by the private sector and by individuals and by philanthropy versus through public policy and through a rights-based approach? I think that's the philosophical thing that I see. And again, it's not either or. We need intervention now. So let's get the money. Let's build community action plans and support community action plans and get funding to the communities. But also let's build power. Let's change the system. And if the current system of governance is obsolete and if our corporate interests are capturing our governments, let's change the system. So those are long-term arcs for justice and for rights.
I can
go ahead.
So I think from my perspective, exactly, it's not an either or.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from a pilot perspective, it's sort of like the system that's being built here is agnostic and could just as easily be a provincial or state level government as a collection of private donors. And so what's most important is that the infrastructure, because also, like, if we're relying on states, I mean, the Ecuadorian state, for instance, there's many stories about the challenges that the Ecuadorian state has had in administering conservation programs like Sociobosque. And so even if the state is going to sort of like engage in that, and I agree, that would be a best case outcome, they're going to need an infrastructure, ideally public infrastructure and open, to be able to administer, monitor, report, and remit based on conservation outcomes. So from my perspective, with the tools available, the most important thing is to sort of show the system working and show the different choice points that the community and actors are engaging with in order to sort of parameterize the administration of it and the successful completion of the project and the flows of money, so that there is really just an apparatus that whoever is remitting can use and whoever's receiving can use to manage that right relationship. Right. Between, I think that's what's most important. I think we can all agree. And I think in different cultural contexts, the communities at the base and the entities that are remitting are going to be very different. In some contexts, it's going to be a state. In other contexts, it might be a multinational corporation. In other contexts, it could be a coalition of philanthropic organizations. In other cases, it could be a crowd fund of everybody in the world contributing. If 210 million people contributed $1 next year, we would have the entire Amazon sacred headwaters preserved for that year, right? So for me, it's like, how do we open all those possibilities up while we're pushing the governments and we're in, I don't know, I think it's sort of a, how do we go on all those fronts at once, in a way?
Yeah, because we're not talking about just a boutique philanthropic, crowdfunding, okay, like there's a crisis here, so let's bring $75,000 to this particular village and, then keep working on the bigger issues at play. Like what I hear you saying, Gregory, and what my experience of this is just that what we're talking about is enabling infrastructure for community-led, locally governed, participatory agreements to start to essentially give us feedback loops about our relationship with life itself and the spiritual realms, and doing that in a cultural context that's appropriate for where that place in question is. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too lost in the philosophical debates of state versus markets, but it does, like when I hear you say all of what you shared, Atosa, I do kind of think about all of the countries that do provide more, social safety nets and basic services. I live in New Zealand. It does a much better job than most at providing a lot of that safety net, even though, with acknowledgments to all the people who get left behind. And yet we're doing all sorts of really ecologically destructive, horrific things as a country. And so, it's like, even if we take care of a lot of those basic rights, we still have this kind of crisis on our hands. And so, yeah, I'm
values. That's where we have to work on cultural values.
Right.
And this idea of, just imagine how much money the industries spend on advertising every year to teach us to be good consumers, to get the latest fashion, to have the latest car and bling and whatever, music, cultural experiences. Even we are constantly being formed to be good consumers. How are we being formed to be good cells in the body of a living earth? To be in harmony, to be in reciprocity, to be in serving the host, which is Mother Earth, while Mother Earth serves us. How are we teaching, and indigenous people do that. Like, they have systems of teaching about, seventh generation and reciprocity and buen vivir. I'm just saying there's multi-layers. Like Donella Meadows always said, we got to change the goals of the system. We have to have good feedback loops, but ultimately we have to change the paradigm that created the system. And that comes from consciousness, that comes from spiritual and philosophical and, basically deep transformation at a personal and collective level. And that comes from culture. We express our human values through culture. And, we're right now being trained to be good consumers. We're not being trained to be good ancestors. So where is the advertising budget for creating a whole generation of good ancestors? And that doesn't, indigenous people are also getting the virus. Like Uyunkara always says, we're getting the virus of money, the chip that makes us only believe in material wealth. And we get infected by that virus as much as anyone else. And so he's always like, we need to continue to evolve. That's why we need to model basically personal and spiritual transformation, both individually and collectively. So yeah, I agree. There's like many deep parts to this, but changing laws, changing values, changing mindsets, and doing triage are all essential here, are all needed.
Which is why I think, for me, the communal process of co-creating a new symbol of value that can displace money and consumerism in the very natural process of status seeking of young people is really important. I think that's why I don't throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater when it relates to sort of like money and status. It's like, it's so deep that we as,
Homo sapiens.
Great apes, we're in these courtship dances, and we're posturing, and we want to accumulate status because we're biologically programmed to try to seek out mates and to have some form of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, hierarchy between different people, jostle for position relative to one another. And I guess I think it's beautiful to sort of transcend that. And I honor that that is a possible way out. But I also, I guess the theory of change that I'm active in at the moment is how do we shift that which allows people to accumulate status? And how do we anchor that in a rooted depth of care for the greater than human world, a rooted depth of experience in carrying forth ancestral traditions, and that to me feels like a profound change, whether it's states or philanthropies or private donors or market forces that can sort of cut through all of those, and that quest to create a symbol that by sort of like earning it, I've done something that is deeply and intrinsically and relationally beneficial to my community and the planet. I think that's what I'm after in creating the pilot around the biocultural Jaguar credits. It's like, what if all of us who are doing this together, especially the community of Sharaminsa, at the end of the day can feel the enormous pride and prestige of having accomplished right relationship and have other people recognize that symbol as something that's potent and really, at the end of the day, a representation of true wealth. Whether or not it's fungible and exchangeable and you swap it for a Lamborghini, actually probably that means that it's not quite right.
Well, I want to get back to what you said, truly watching how Sharaminsa over the years, started the ecotourism program, said no to oil, now saying no to the road, and said no to the logging, and is now doing the reducing hunting and wanting to do food systems that don't rely so much on wild animals, and solar canoe project. They have so many innovative things that they're doing, and they're so proud of being leaders and models.
As they should be.
I think they should be, and I think that is a cultural. That's valuing a cultural trend of being, just want to be the best stewards they can and want to keep their youth and want to be proud. And the pride of being a good guardian and being Earth is in a way the bonus with the, you're getting the community fund, but really the real thing you're getting is this process of being who you are and who you truly can be, your potential of being great guardians. Like how would you say, maybe the ultimate guardians and the ultimate model for guiding their own people. Like they're actually going to the other communities who are way behind and are much more likely to accept the road and saying, look, we want to share. We want you to come along. We want you to join this kind of pride of being good guardians. And I think in some ways that's even more valuable than the money.
100%.
And, I think that's what we can, the money is helpful to meet the basic needs so they can aspire to so much more.
Right.
But at the same time, if we also empower youth to be great organizers and leaders and get laws passed and referendum we got, since you were in the Amazon, we were successful through a massive coalition effort to get the people of Ecuador to vote on a public referendum to leave oil in the ground. The people of Ecuador made a decision to forgo $1 billion a year in state revenues.
Yes, unidos.
They made a decision to say no to $1 billion in oil revenues in order to protect the Yasuni National Park. They made a choice, life over money. And that was, that's, I think, another example. We could be, in addition to the Jaguar credits, promoting referendums for climate action and biodiversity protection, laws that end extractive industries, that uphold community rights and support basic needs of communities to education and healthcare. So, it's not either or, I agree, and it is urgent. So I'm excited, Gregory, you're on this journey with us, and more to come. I think we are, I think we need to replicate the pride of being good leaders in many more communities across this region.
Yeah. So well said. I want to ask you for any final closing thoughts and how to follow along on this journey for anyone watching. And I also want to just share a closing reflection through the prism of a lot of the conversations we've been having, and just underscore this point, which we didn't go into, too much detail around. But, there's so many of those small decisions that aren't really small, like you said, these links in the chain of, what is the agreement around measuring and verification, and what defines the collective success, if you will, and the goals of that stewardship. And these are not rules being passed down from ivory tower academics, with all due respect to everyone in those towers, but they're not being passed down top down through contracts that the local community can't even begin to decipher, and laden with all sorts of additional gotchas and loopholes that favor large scale corporations and so forth. Like, what we're seeing are so many well-intentioned ideas about the development of nature markets, about the MRV revolution and the sensing and so forth, about new financial mechanisms to try to bring payments for ecosystem services. And yet, what we're also seeing through a lot of these conversations are tendencies for that power to still accrue back up to either the buyers, or the corporates, or the kind of distanced academic research that isn't necessarily defining what's important to those local communities. And so I think to tackle this enabling technical infrastructure in a way that actually honors that local grassroots, bioregional, bottoms-up type of patterning is unique in the space. And so, yeah, just acknowledgments to you both. And please, anything else that either of you like to share, and how to follow along on the journey?
Well, I would just say I'm super grateful for the collaboration, and I'm very excited about Amazon Sacred Headwaters' sort of stance to observe and support the pilot taking place, but also create a neutral space to observe what's happening, and to bring in youth leaders, and to bring in other communities, so that this does create a transparent system where the monitoring and measurement and the contracts and the branding, are we calling it this, are we calling it that, actually can serve as the foundation for real learning. And my hope is that the way that it's being approached, the intentionality, and the sort of the level of openness leads to something that is truly truly a gift that we're co-creating together, that truly really lands. And so I'm, with all humility, sort of, I think it's been very beautiful process to feel all of the allies gathered around this community of Shadaminsa, but also really in service to the spirit of the larger Amazon Sacred Headwaters, all of those communities, to say, let's do our best job to try to create something that makes all of this just a little bit more tangible, that we can walk around and we can poke at something that's real, and take it apart and put it back together again if that's what's needed, or make minor tweaks and move it over there. I don't know what the result is, and I'm super grateful for the people who've donated, who've purchased these credits. And most of all, as I was mentioning, just grateful really for the community of Shadaminsa and their leadership in sharing their dream, right? In sharing the dream of a living forest, and being willing to explore what it looks like to have an experiment like this that could potentially affect so many different levels, but at the end of the day could also serve mostly as a learning lesson for us to do something that's radically different at the end of the year when we all sit down together and deeply interrogate what happened and what worked. So, yeah, very grateful.
I'm grateful for this partnership as well, and for basically this opportunity to go to the headwaters of the Amazon, but also to the headwaters of the issues that we're facing on the poly crisis, and really look at the paradigmatic dimensions, ontological dimensions, and the systems change dimensions. I'm excited about the work also to have the indigenous peoples of the sacred headwaters have created their own foundation governed by majority indigenous led. 24 of the 27 organizations are indigenous. I'm excited about creating facilities to get direct funding to the rest of the sacred headwaters. But I have to say that it's also sometimes very daunting given the scale of the challenges and the urgency. So it's this thing about how do you go with great intentions, with allyship that's long-term, with deep listening and questioning and distilling and being basically guided by our dreams, by the voices of nature and the indigenous people who live there. And, basically I'm inspired by the work, and I'm also hoping that we are reaching a critical mass of getting the support we need to implement this initiative to protect the headwaters and the rest of the Amazon for that matter. So more, it's like an invitation to bring brilliance and patience and allyship for basically an existential crisis that we face.
Atossa Saltani, Gregory Landua, thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching this conversation. We are just wrapping up day 1 at Earth Commons and Funding the Commons in Berkeley. I see they're literally turning out the lights in the hallway, so we've exhausted our available time. Please check out the other videos. We'll be publishing more conversations from tomorrow, day 2, as well as from earlier today. Like, share, subscribe, all of that. Check out the show notes for links to this fantastic pilot. We will continue to track and have conversations about what we're learning together. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Matthew.